It's great to welcome to the program today Stephen Donziger, who's a human rights attorney who helped indigenous groups in Ecuador win a historic $10 billion pollution judgment against Chevron. If you want to help what he's doing, you can go to freedonziger.com. It's really great having you on. I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me, David. I appreciate it.
So to start with, what first brought your attention to the effects of oil drilling in Ecuador, and how did you first get involved in all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I was a year out of law school back in the early 90s. I was One of my classmates was from Ecuador, and he told me about this, and I was part of a team in the early 90s that went down to investigate what turned out to be, the worst oil disaster on the planet, or so we thought. We called it the Amazon Chernobyl. Essentially, what we discovered is that Texaco, an American company, now Chevron, had deliberately dumped billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste onto indigenous ancestral lands in the Amazon, creating a wave of cancers and other health and economic problems for the people. We filed a lawsuit as a result of that first trip, and 28 years later, here I am, our team is still fighting to hold Chevron accountable. We won the lawsuit, by the way. They just have not paid yet. And that's where the battle is at this point.
There are so many different aspects of this to talk about, including the eventual charges against you, as you talk about the fact that the judgment has not been paid. Just to pick something, and we'll kind of go through these different things. As this was going on and you were working on this, the documentary film Crude was being produced. And one might argue that the production of the film opened the door to allege fraud against you by what was allegedly left out of the film. So can you talk to us a little bit about your involvement in the film and whether in hindsight it was a mistake?
Sure. So in 2007, Joe Berlinger, who's an acclaimed documentary filmmaker, decided to make a film about, really this epic battle by indigenous groups against Chevron and their legal team, of which I was a part. I thought the film was great. It came out in 2009. It's called Crude. You can still get it on Netflix or on YouTube. But more to the point is Chevron, when they started to lose the case in Ecuador based on the evidence, tried to exploit the film to come after me. Let me be very, very clear. Chevron has alleged that I committed some sort of fraud down in Ecuador. I reject that. It's never been proven. I've never been charged with a crime. And the reality is 28 different appellate judges, 6 appellate courts in Ecuador and Canada have rejected that theory. But they tried to claim that based on the movie and some certain things I said in the movie, which frankly were impolitic, just stuff I was saying with the camera on, 15 years ago, was somehow evidence of fraud, and it's never been accepted by any court. And I reject it. And again, the judgment in Ecuador that I helped win has been affirmed by multiple appellate courts around the world. So it's a valid judgment, and I just reject that. But it's a good film if people want to see it, because it really does capture a lot of what was going on in Ecuador at the time.
So to answer the one piece of that I didn't hear an answer to, in hindsight, did it create problems for that film to be produced?
Well, that's a question. It's funny. That's an important question. And I get asked that a fair amount. Like, if you could do it over, would you have made the film?
Yeah.
I don't know. When you go through a journey like I've been on, you sort of operate on the information you have at the time you make decisions. And the information I had at the time, and my clients, more importantly, the people of Ecuador I was working with, thought it would be really good for their campaign to illuminate via a film, the injustices that were being inflicted upon them by Chevron. Nor did they anticipate that how Chevron would try to exploit it for litigation purposes. Had we known that, maybe my clients would have made a different decision. But, at this point, it's water under the bridge. The fact is the film is out there.
Yeah.
It's a good film. And I think overall, my personal assessment is that it helps the campaign.
So, okay, I want to be precise in how I kind of broach this next topic. As you pointed out, there have been allegations made that the judgment you obtained was obtained through racketeering, extortion, wire fraud, witness tampering, money laundering, etc. You've denied those allegations, and you correctly point out those have not been proven in court. It's beyond my ability here to examine every single one of those individually. I've done a fair share of research about this. I can't unequivocally say there's no merit to any of it, but you're completely right that none of it's been proven in court. Ultimately, your imprisonment in the United States and the suspension of your law license was not based on any of that, but contempt. Is that correct?
That's contempt of court, yes.
And that is a misdemeanor?
It was treated that way in my case. I mean, if I may, I think there's a bigger issue here that I'd like to point out.
Fair.
In the limited time we have.
Yeah.
Because there's obviously no way in this limited time we can go through all these allegations.
Right.
The big issue is it's been proven in a court of law, and Chevron has admitted that its predecessor company, Texaco, deliberately dumped literally billions of gallons of toxic waste in the Amazon, which is literally killing thousands of people as we speak.
Yes.
In my view, as their defense strategy, they're like, oh, let's distract from that by focusing on Steve Donziger. Okay, so the more we talk about me, and I sort of, when I agree to be on the show, like I obviously knew this, but like the more we talk about me, the less we talk about the real problem, which is the poisoning of the Amazon in a way that is decimating indigenous groups, even hurtling them toward extinction. That's the real issue here. So the issue is not me, it's them. Now, if we want to talk about me and their allegations against me, I'm happy to do that. And I do that all the time because, again, they've never been proven in a court of law. And it puts me on the defensive, which I don't like.
Yeah,
but
and
I'm
to be
happy
clear,
to talk about them. But they're simply, I'm just telling you, they're simply unproven. And in my view, they're not true. It's just a strategy. It's like a corporate playbook to distract attention from a human rights atrocity that Chevron committed by focusing on the lawyer. And you see this all the time. And the bigger issue to me in a society where, and I don't think this is a right-left political issue, it's like, what kind of society do we want to have where you can advocate for people? Lawyers should be able to do their jobs and advocate without being personally attacked by the party that they beat in court. And that's what's happened to me with the help, unfortunately, of a federal judge here, who I've accused of being, biased. And the final thing I'll point out, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which is a very respected legal body that's been cited by our own State Department on many of an occasion, where they point out people who've been arbitrarily detained, ruled in September that the United States government should release me immediately. I'm not free, even though I'm home. I'm in detention at home right now.
Yes.
That they should release me immediately and pay me compensation because my detention violates multiple provisions of international law and is clearly retaliation against my advocacy for indigenous groups in a case that has been, I think, manipulated by Chevron and the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
I know that's a lot to absorb, but the larger issue is my case it goes way beyond me, and it really raises a lot of issues about what kind of freedom we want, what's the role of lawyers in our society, can you do climate justice work without being locked up? I mean, what's happened to me, I think, is just wrong. And it's not indicative of the best part of our country. It's very unusual in the United States to have a lawyer, a climate justice lawyer like me, locked up. And I just think it's wrong.
With no question. And to be clear, if I don't mention as a jumping off point for this conversation that the allegations exist, I'm not doing my job, but I can completely concede it's beyond the scope of this to adjudicate them.
I am totally cool with how you're asking the question, and I love your work generally. I'm happy to take the question. I just wanted to make the larger point. That's all.
When it comes to the ulterior motives, what is your assertion about the role of the American court system, Judge Kaplan, et cetera, and Chevron, formerly known as Texaco?
Look, I think as a general matter, our federal judiciary in particular has become very politicized in the last 2-3 decades in a way it never was before. And I think I'm sort of paying the price for that personally right now. There's different groups in the judiciary, and I think the appointment of judges has become so political that you're getting judges now on the bench that are really carrying out, I think, political agendas rather than doing what they should be doing, which is looking at the facts and ruling on the law in the most neutral way possible. So, what Judge Kaplan has done to engineer my detention without a jury, I want to emphasize that. I never had a jury. He manipulated the case such that, that I wouldn't get a jury. I couldn't defend myself. In other words, the allegation against me on the contempt side was that I didn't comply with his court order that I turned my computer over to Chevron. And the reason I didn't comply is I appealed it to protect the privileges held by my clients in Ecuador, their privileged information, their identities. They would have been hurt had this information been released and been put at risk. Their lives would have been put at risk. So I thought I behaved ethically. And I'll point out there's never been a lawyer in the history of our country who's been charged criminally for doing what I did, that is challenging a civil discovery order on appeal. It's never happened before. So why is it happening to the one guy who actually won a $10 billion judgment against Chevron? I mean, it makes no sense. And I'll make this point. When Judge Kaplan charged me, he went to the SDNY, the federal prosecutor here in Manhattan, to ask them to prosecute the case. And they refused to prosecute me. He then, rather than letting it sit, he then appointed a private law firm to prosecute me, Seward and Kissel. And he didn't disclose, and we found out 7 months later that this law firm, Seward and Kissel, had Chevron as a client. It has numerous clients at high levels of the fossil fuel industry. So this became, in my opinion, the nation's first private criminal prosecution. They immediately detained me pre-trial on a misdemeanor, which is unheard of. I mean, they locked me up in my home with an ankle bracelet. And because of COVID and the trial kept getting delayed, that ended up lasting 26 months, 2 years and 2 months. And on top of that, the judge, who was also appointed by Judge Kaplan, Judge Preska, sentenced me to 6 months in prison, where I ended up reporting to federal prison for defending my clients in the Amazon. And I just think it was grossly unfair. I ended up getting out after 45 days, but I'm now back home in detention to serve the rest of my sentence. So all in all, for this misdemeanor, where the maximum sentence is 6 months, I am going to end up serving close to 3 years by the time it's over.
And so a couple of other details on that. At one point, there was an $800,000 bail set for a misdemeanor. That's the highest in U.S. history for a misdemeanor, if I understand correctly.
That's our understanding. So on top of being the first person charged with this kind of misdemeanor locked up prior to trial, I was also given the highest bail ever for a lawyer on a misdemeanor in U.S. history. And I'll point out that $800,000 bail was actually higher than 3 of the 4 police officers involved in the killing of George Floyd, which I find astounding. I mean, there's people who commit serious, violent crimes who have lower bails than I got.
When Judge Preska wrote the ruling against you, there was this question as to what specific connection there was with the ruling in Ecuador. And I know you've generally spoken about political interests, among the ranks of judges, et cetera. Is there anything more specific about Judge Preska that you think should be understood or known about the connection to fossil fuels?
Yes. I mean, and let me just say, I respect judges in the rule of law. Like I'm a lawyer, and I don't mean to disrespect Judge Preska, but there's a couple of problems with her presiding over my case. One is she's a leader of the Federalist Society, to which Chevron is probably the largest funder. The Federalist Society is a legal organization. It's a fine legal organization, but it is very pro-corporate. And a lot of corporations fund it, and she is a very public leader, and she identifies with an organization that gets funds from Chevron. And I just think that's a major conflict of interest. I don't think she should have presided over my case. And, the other thing I'll point out about Judge Preska is I don't think she ever should have been appointed to this case because, there's rules here in the federal judiciary and in New York in particular that cases need to be signed randomly. And Judge Kaplan, I believe, chose her for a reason. They're close colleagues. They've been on the bench together for over 25 years. And I think she treated me very unfairly. I mean, she's the one who made the decision to lock me up pre-trial for over 2 years, on a theory that I was a risk of flight. Like, I have a wife and a teenage son. I'm really going to flee. It's absurd, the country, to avoid a misdemeanor. I mean, so there was all these things happening where I believe she and Judge Kaplan sort of colluded to impose a very punitive suffering on me, punishment, before I was ever convicted of a crime. And I will point out that my so-called conviction, which again, I assert my innocence, it's under appeal, okay, right now, was imposed without a jury. I insisted on a jury so I could have an unbiased fact finder rather than a person I believe was a biased judge. And Judge Prescott repeatedly denied me a jury, repeatedly refused to remove the prosecutor, even though she was from a Chevron law firm, the private prosecutor. So there are all these features to the trial that led the United Nations jurors to conclude there was what they called a staggering level of judicial bias in my case.
It's an incredible and disturbing story in a number of different ways. We've been speaking with Stephen Donziger, and you can learn much more about what's going on at freedonziger.com. I really appreciate your time and you giving us your insights into what took place.
Thank you, David. I appreciate your work as well. Thanks for having me.